Hey y'all, Alex from Music Hub here, and today we'll be doing a review slash historical look, analysis, whatever you want to call it, of the 1823 poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, most well known nowadays as The Night Before Christmas. Now, I'm going to make one thing clear. I don't intend on making very many videos about poems for a couple of reasons. Number one, they're very short pieces of media. There's a lot of them that could warrant entire videos and should warrant entire videos, and I just don't have the time for it. And two, poetic analysis is not something that I have much background in. There are other people out there who can fill that niche better, more capably than I am able to. And given that I've spent the last few weeks reading the works of the English Romantic poets, it probably seems silly that instead of talking about Don Juan or Prometheus Unbound or Ode to a Nightingale, that I'm talking about The Night Before Christmas out of all poems. But I did want to talk about the cultural significance of this poem in particular and pay it the respect that it deserves as a classic work of children's literature and, I would say, American literature. So let's set the scene here. Needless to say, Christmas celebrations were substantially different in 1823 than they were even 100 years later, to say nothing of what they are like today. The United States wasn't quite 50 years old at the time, and depending on where you went in the country, you could find an entirely different way of celebrating the holiday that, assuming the place you were at celebrated Christmas in the first place. The remaining Puritans who lived in the Northeast were especially hostile to the idea of celebrating Christmas because, in their eyes, the sort of boisterous acts of celebration drifted away from the so-called true meaning of the holiday. But it's to the Northeast where we start our journey because the birth of modern U.S. Christmas celebration starts, perhaps unsurprisingly, in New York with the publication of Washington Irving's A History of New York in 1809. I mentioned this work briefly in my reviews of the Brian J. Jones biography of Washington Irving, as well as the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, and one of the stories told in Irving's satirical history of New York is in Chapter 5 of Book 1, the tale of a Dutch sailor, Olaf van Kortlandt, who was shipwrecked on the island of Manhattan. There's a constant theme in this book of the patron saint of St. Nicholas. Olaf and his crew sail across the ocean in a boat where the bow is shaped in the visage of St. Nicholas. And the night after the wreck, Olaf, who's nicknamed Olaf the Dreamer in this story, is greeted with a vision of St. Nicholas riding in a wagon bringing, quote, his yearly presents to children, end quote, and encouraging the marooned seamen to settle the island. The book was an enormous success, and St. Nicholas's supposed connection to the founding myth of New York City fixed his image in the city's proverbial spotlight, dead center. Irving revisits Christmas in the 5th volume of the Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, where he details English Christmas celebrations in a manner that almost seems like proto-Dickens, and he encourages Americans to start adopting some of those customs. Again, this work was met with significant acclaim, and so we do have to give a lot of credit to Irving for laying the groundwork of so many of these Christmas traditions, but there was still pushback from Puritans as well as certain other Protestant denominations who felt that the concept of Christmas in general was too closely aligned with Catholic values. It was considered a Catholic holiday. And then, on the 23rd of December, 1823, an anonymous poem called Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas was published in the Troy Sentinel, a local newspaper in upstate New York. This poem, a simplistic little verse that was clearly intended to be read by and to children, added a twist to the story by setting the ride of St. Nicholas, or as he's called in the prologue to the poem, Santa Claus, on the night of Christmas Eve instead of Christmas Day. Also added to the tale were several other things not widely associated with the Nicholas story at the time. The wagon is changed into a sleigh. The sleigh flies and is pulled by 8 reindeer, all given very distinctive names. And Saint Nick himself was described as a portly fellow dressed in red with a snow-white beard who puts gifts in kids' stockings by climbing down people's chimneys. The imagery is fantastical without getting too abstract for young readers, and the religious connotations to the act of gift giving are shifted aside. They're not severed completely. The time of year is still important to the tale, but the relationship is not as obvious because they shift the time from Christmas Day to Christmas Eve, and certainly nobody could mistake this for a purely Catholic tale. And nobody did mistake it for that. In fact, religious and secular audiences alike adored this poem, and it quickly became one of the most reprinted works of literature in the entire state, both in children's readers and schools and in newspapers as well. And eventually it became one of the most reprinted works of literature in the entire country. Now, whether or not this poem is intentionally subversive in regards to all of these established traditions is impossible to answer, but that's in large part because we don't know the author's identity with 100% certainty. By far the most likely candidate, given that he himself took credit for it 20 years later and pretty much all the textual evidence points to it being him, is the writer and theological professor Clement Clark Moore, born the 15th of July, 1779 in New York City, died the 10th of July, 1863 in Newport, Rhode Island. A Protestant theologian and educator, Moore supposedly wrote the poem to entertain his children and didn't acknowledge his affiliation with it until years later, so as to not let it overshadow his other writings and his teaching career. With that explanation in mind, it certainly doesn't encourage thinking of this as intentionally subversive, since Moore didn't necessarily want himself associated with it, but the tangible impact remains the same regardless. The act of gift-giving became increasingly popular as a standalone activity after the release of this poem, apart from religious celebrations entirely, and the reemergence of Old English Christmas celebrations, specifically those of the Tudors, permanently connected the St. Nicholas or Santa Claus myth with festive dancing, decorations, and the usage of pine trees as decor. By the end of the Civil War, even the Puritan crowds couldn't ignore the Christmas festivities that were going on, and Christmas was finally declared a federal holiday by the U.S. government in 1870. Christmas-centric music was reprinted, Old English carols being reprinted into modern contexts, and new material was written quite frequently in the 19th century, and the early to mid-20th century saw the emergence of recorded Christmas music, with songs such as White Christmas riding waves of good tidings to unprecedented levels of commercial success. In fact, to this day, White Christmas remains the best-selling single song in the history of recorded music. But that whole situation is a topic for another date. I don't think it's a stretch to call The Night Before Christmas the most important poem in American history. If not on a literary level, then certainly on a cultural level. So much of how we celebrate the holiday today, so much of the department store decorations, the multicolored wrapping paper, and the Mariah Carey tunes can be directly traced back to the single 56-line poem. And to the religious purists among us, this may not be a great thing. The divide between commercialism and the so-called, always ambiguous, true meaning of Christmas is a controversial debate today, just as it's been for decades now. But as for me, I'm still met with a sense of comfort when I read this poem. Being nestled in my bed with visions of sugar plums dancing in my head does sound pretty enticing, even if I've never tasted a sugar plum in my life. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. It's a slightly different type of video from what I normally make and what I'm planning on making going forward. I just thought it would be interesting, given the time of year that we're in right now, to discuss this and maybe generate some conversation about The Night Before Christmas. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time right here on Music Hub.